Karoline Leavitt mocked Jasmine Crockett's husband, but when he stood up, the room went silent. It started with a smirk, not a policy debate, not a legislative disagreement, a smirk. The kind you only see when someone thinks the room is theirs, the stage, the script, the spotlight. Karoline Leavitt had flown into Columbus, Ohio, with the confidence of a seasoned media storm. The town hall was supposed to be quiet, local voices, family values, a routine civic forum. But in under 10 seconds, it became something else, a viral rupture that would rewrite the definition of strength for millions. The insult wasn't subtle, it wasn't coded, it was surgical. A calculated dig aimed not at policy, but at a man who hadn't said a single word. "I just think it's interesting," Karoline said, her voice sweet with venom, "how some politicians parade around about strong families, while their own husbands can't even stand up straight." What was his name again? Terrence. Looks like the type who lets his wife wear the pants, the belt, and the shoes. There it was, the strike, delivered with a grin polished by years in conservative media. Echo chambers where emasculation is the punchline and family values are weaponized for applause lines. The crowd made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a cough. A few nervous chuckles bubbled up, but no one really laughed, especially not him. Terrence Crockett didn't twitch, didn't speak, didn't even glance sideways. He sat 4 rows back, navy blazer, beige slacks, no tie. His hands folded calmly in his lap, his eyes forward. He looked like someone who had heard this tone before, not just once, 1,000 times. The insinuation that stillness meant softness, that quiet meant submission, that support was somehow weakness. Jasmine didn't move either. She sat on the stage across from Karoline, hands wrapped around a water bottle. Her eyes didn't blink. Her grip just tightened 1 degree, maybe 2. Her husband's name had been used like a joke, a prop in a rhetorical setup. But Jasmine didn't interrupt, because she didn't have to. The silence that followed wasn't absence. It was pressure. And 5 seconds later, the silence stood up. He didn't rush, didn't flinch. He just stood, smoothly, deliberately, like he had decided before his feet moved, like his body knew the weight of this moment. The room rippled, heads turned, cameras adjusted, moderators hesitated. Even Karoline blinked. For a half second, she wasn't sure if this was part of the plan. It wasn't. Terrence Crockett stepped into the center aisle, calm, no anger in his face, no notes in his hand, just a man who'd been dragged into a performance and decided quietly to close the curtain. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The act of rising in that moment was louder than any microphone. He stopped just a few feet from the stage. He didn't take the podium, didn't need the spotlight. He stood where her eyes had nowhere to hide. And then the voice, smooth, low, controlled. "I heard what you said. Simple, no dramatics, just clarity, like glass shattering in a church." Karoline stiffened fingers, tapping once then twice on the podium. "Sir, this isn't the Q&A portion. You can take a seat." But Terrence didn't move. "You brought me up," he said. "Not my wife, not my kids, me. So, I'm going to speak, and you're going to listen." That's when the air changed. The moderator stopped shuffling papers. The sound tech froze mid-adjustment. The cameraman didn't zoom. He held. Because the moment was no longer political. It was personal. It was sacred. "You don't have to agree with me," Terrence continued. "And I'm not asking for applause. But if you're going to say my name into a microphone in front of strangers, you'll hear it from me in full." The crowd didn't move. You could hear the plastic chairs creaking under shifting weight. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else whispered, "Is this happening?" Karoline laughed, forced, high-pitched. "It was a joke," she said. "You're a public figure now." "No," Terrence said. "I'm not." His voice didn't rise, but somehow it hit harder. "I'm a private man. I married a public woman. I show up when she needs me. I stay quiet when the fight is about politics. But when you turn support into shame, when you take a man's stillness and call it surrender, that's not a joke. That's a message. And silence in that moment becomes permission." His words weren't scripted, but they were carved from experience, from restraint, from years of letting things slide, because it wasn't worth it. He turned to the crowd now, not grandstanding, just opening the circle. "I don't need to swing to be strong. I don't need a podium to be present. I'm not loud. I'm consistent. I hold my wife's hand when she walks out of rooms like this. I tell her when the day ends she can breathe because I've got the rest." Every man in the room stopped shifting. Every woman leaned in. And Jasmine. She didn't cry, didn't smile. She exhaled, slowly. Like a weight had been named finally in public. Karoline tried again. "So, this is a speech about gender roles now," no Terrence said. "It's a reminder," he continued, "of what respect looks like." He didn't pause for effect. He didn't ask for agreement. He just stood. And that's when the silence flipped. It stopped being awkward. It became sacred. Because sometimes the most radical thing a man can do is stand up when the script says, "Sit down." And what shattered the room wasn't his volume. It was the weight of being fully quietly present on purpose. The weight of presence isn't always felt in volume. Sometimes it settles into a room, like weather, unspoken, undeniable. And as Terence Crockett stood there unmoved by the performative flicks of political sarcasm or the fading smirk of a media tactician, something unspoken became real. He didn't demand the room, he redirected it. And when he sat down again, folding his hands in his lap, just as they had been 5 minutes before, it was like time had reset. But everything was different, not louder, just heavier. Jasmine turned her head just slightly. A nod, not theatrical, not even affectionate, just recognition from one person who knows how rare it is to be fully seen to another, who just proved he always had been. But who was this man really? That's the question that lingered for many watching in the room, and later across millions of screens. Because in an age of political fireworks and Twitter tantrums, what just happened wasn't noise. It was signal, and signal only works when it comes from a place grounded deep enough to survive distortion. Terence Crockett had always preferred the back row. Not because he lacked opinion or backbone, but because he understood something too few men in politics ever learn, that supporting your partner doesn't mean standing in front of them. It means standing behind them steady so they can move forward without looking back. A decade ago, Terence had been a social worker, the kind who didn't burn out because he didn't pretend the system could be saved, only that it could be softened for those stuck inside it. He didn't tweak case statistics. He didn't attend think tanks. He spent his days driving to homes no politician visited, and his evenings helping fix broken sinks in apartments that no landlord ever answered a call for. He married Jasmine not because she was political, but because she was principled. And when her path pulled her into the light of committee hearings, state debates, and network interrogations, Terence didn't panic. He adjusted. He ran his small business, took care of their niece, and learned the rhythm of her work, the fire she brought to rooms that didn't want to hear her voice. He never wanted the spotlight. In fact, if you searched his name before that town hall, you'd find almost nothing. No press, no speeches, just one blurred photo from a community fundraiser and an outdated LinkedIn profile with 3 bullet points. But here's the thing. Sometimes the people who say the least carry the most. And when Karoline Leavitt tried to shrink him into a punchline, the quiet man, the passive husband, the presumed absence behind a powerful woman, she triggered something she didn't see coming. She didn't understand the anatomy of restraint, because restraint isn't lack of strength, it's proof of it. And that night, as Terence walked back to his chair, eyes forward, expression steady, the audience saw what too many overlook, that the loudest man in the room is rarely the one holding anything up. He wasn't defending his masculinity, he was redefining it, and it hit different. Because it didn't arrive in a fury, it arrived with posture, it arrived in full. You could feel it. In the shift of bodies leaning forward, in the stillness of a moderator who suddenly couldn't remember the next bullet point, in the subtle glance Jasmine gave her husband when he sat down, the kind of glance that isn't romantic or performative, but rooted. The glance you give someone who did something you didn't ask them to do, but always knew they could. Karoline tried to move on. That's what media training tells you to do: pivot, regain control, reassert dominance. So, she cleared her throat, adjusted her notes, and said with forced cheer, "Well, now that we've heard from the first gentleman, let's get back to the real issues: urban crime, family structure, things that actually matter to voters." It didn't land, because the room had already redefined what family structure meant. It wasn't a demographic, it was a moment, and that moment was Terence. Across the stage, Jasmine hadn't moved much, but something in her posture was different, straighter, calmer. Not because she had been protected, but because someone had helped her carry the weight without making it about himself. That's what Karoline didn't get. That's what she still couldn't see. She thought the insult was clever, that it would land like a dart on a cable news chyron. But what she didn't expect was that the quietest man in the room had been waiting for years to answer a question no one knew they were asking. What does it look like when a man shows up not to take the mic, but to hold the space? And more than that, to refuse to be used. Because Karoline hadn't mocked a policy. She hadn't challenged a vote. She had taken a black man's quiet in a room where he was simply supporting his wife and turned it into an invitation for ridicule. And he answered it with presence, with clarity, with a message that made half the audience reevaluate their definition of manhood and the other half reconsider who they'd been clapping for. No yelling, no anger, just architecture. Because that's what Terence Crockett brought into that room, not just defense, foundation. Later, people would ask Jasmine what she thought, what it felt like to have her husband defend her on live television. And her answer would be simple. He didn't defend me. He reminded the room who we are. And that might be the most powerful part of it all. He didn't just shift the moment, he changed the measurement. And once a room learns a new way to measure strength, it becomes much harder to sell them noise again. That was the quiet truth that lingered long after Terence sat down, not shouted, not branded, just breathed in by everyone who had witnessed it. And it wasn't just that his words hit, it was that they rearranged something inside the room. Karoline may have still been standing, but her gravity had shifted. She was no longer the center. She was orbiting someone else's stillness. You could feel her trying to pull it back. She spoke faster stacked buzzwords, urban crime, family erosion, liberal chaos. She tried to wrap herself in data points, hoping that facts might camouflage the fracture. But she wasn't leading anymore. She was reacting. And the crowd. They weren't responding like they had before. They weren't nodding. They weren't clapping on cue. They were watching. Still. Changed. And then came the moment that no one expected, the shift from personal reckoning to public recognition. Phones lit up. Not because someone told them to, but because they couldn't not record what they had just witnessed. In the second row, a college student tapped his phone screen, capturing a still shot of Terence returning to his seat. The caption came instantly, almost instinctively. This man just shut down the room without raising his voice. By the time Karoline reached her third policy point, that post had 3,000 likes, and rising. Another angle surfaced from a woman seated near the back, her camera shaky, but her voice crystal clear as she whispered, "He didn't even move fast, and still, I can't stop thinking about it." That video, 30 seconds long, no filter, was reposted by 5 different activist pages within the hour. What started as a political jab had mutated into a cultural event, because what Terence did wasn't just rare, it was needed, and people didn't know they needed it until it happened. Online, the narrative exploded. Best moment I've ever seen at a town hall. Every husband in America take notes. Terence Crockett redefined masculinity in 2 minutes flat. Cable networks tried to catch up. Local affiliates clipped segments. Panelists on left-leaning shows praised his tone. Even some conservative commentators, grasping for a foothold, acknowledged the power of his restraint, though they tried to frame it as unexpected poise, as if it was a one-off. But the internet doesn't do one-offs. It does symbols. And Terence became one. Not because he asked to be, not because he wanted to be, but because truth, when delivered quietly and without ego, echoes longer. And Jasmine. She still hadn't spoken. Not really. She nodded. She breathed. She listened. And when Karoline finally turned to her, trying to claw the spotlight back with a shaky joke, Jasmine simply adjusted. Her mic leaned in and said the most devastating thing possible. "I think everything that needed to be said tonight has already been said." The room didn't cheer. It inhaled. Because that was the moment it became clear Jasmine and Terence weren't just playing defense. They were showing people what strength looks like, not just in marriage, but in public life, not dominance. Not posturing, partnership. The kind you don't see enough in politics. The kind the GOP doesn't know how to commodify, because it can't be yelled, it has to be lived. Karoline tried to pivot again. She recited crime statistics. She threw in the phrase fatherless households, hoping the old triggers would still work, but they didn't. Because the room had already seen what presence looked like. It had already witnessed what it meant when a man sat quietly, then stood not to rescue a woman, but to speak for himself, and in doing so, lifted everyone in the process. That's what Karoline didn't understand. She thought she was throwing a jab, but Terence turned it into a mirror, and when people looked into it, they didn't just see him. They saw who they wanted to be. That's when the cultural shift began. A middle school teacher in Detroit played the clip during a civics class. Her students didn't look away once. At the end, a 13-year-old boy raised his hand and asked, "Why don't we ever see that kind of man on TV?" A father in Phoenix posted, "I didn't know how to talk to my son about being strong without yelling. I do now." A pastor in North Carolina scrapped his Sunday sermon and opened with, "A man stood up, not to shout, but to remind us what dignity looks like." The moment kept traveling, not because it was engineered to, because it was undeniable. Meanwhile, Terrence went home. He didn't check his phone much. He didn't track the views. He swept the back room of his shop, picked up groceries, fixed the leaky faucet that had been bothering Jasmine for 2 weeks. But the people around him, they noticed. They paused when they saw him. Some just gave a small nod. One man, a retired Navy vet, gripped his hand outside a gas station and said, "You said what I've wanted to say for years. Thank you." Terrence just smiled. "Take care of your people," he replied. That was all. Because for him, the moment had passed. But for the world that had watched, it had only just begun. Jasmine Ever, the measured presence, was invited to appear on multiple networks. She chose only one. And when the host opened with the headline, "Karoline Leavitt mocked your husband," he fired back. Jasmine stopped him cold. This wasn't about a fireback, she said. This was about what happens when someone tries to shape your family into a caricature. And instead, they remind the country what real love, real partnership, and real presence actually looks like. And then she said the line that would end up on t-shirts, TikTok captions, and blackboards across the country. "My husband didn't come to defend me. He came to remind people that strength doesn't always stomp into a room. Sometimes it just stands up when it needs to." And that's the truth that shattered the noise. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grab a mic. He didn't insult anyone. He just stood. And everything changed. Not all at once, not like a spotlight flicking on or a curtain dropping. It was subtler than that. A shift in posture, a breath held longer than usual, the collective realization that something unspoken had just settled into the room like dust after a sudden storm. The show had changed, and no one had told Karoline. Because when a man like Terrence Crockett stands without force, when he speaks without needing volume, when he walks back to his seat without looking for applause, the room doesn't go back to normal. It waits, watches, recalculates. Karoline Leavitt, for all her media polish, felt it immediately. Not in her brain, but in her gut. That dull unease when the audience starts seeing through you. She shuffled her notes. She adjusted the mic. She tried to recover the rhythm that had always worked for her. Sharp jabs, loaded stats, cleanly rehearsed barbs. But this time her lines bounced back weightless. She tried humor again. "Well," she said, flashing her best practice smile that was poetic. A few chuckles trickled in. Nervous, not real. The kind of laugh people offer out of habit, not belief. And she knew it. Still, she powered forward. Because when your only weapon is volume, you don't recalibrate, you double down. "But I'm not here to debate gender roles or write Hallmark cards," she said, her tone tightening. "I'm here to talk about numbers, policy, what actually matters to the American people." But that was the problem. She'd already lost them. Because the American people in that room in their folding chairs and scuffed sneakers with their crumpled question cards and quiet expectations had just seen something more valuable than a white paper or a policy point. They saw restraint used as resistance. They saw a man uphold dignity without burning the house down. And once you see that, it's hard to be impressed by someone trying to sell you theater. Even Jasmine hadn't spoken since her one-liner, that soft but pointed "I think everything that needed to be said has already been said." She didn't need to. She sat calmly, hands resting in her lap, expression unshaken. And somehow, that silence again was louder than anything Karoline could summon. But Karoline wasn't ready to give up the fight, so she pivoted again. "Let's talk about crime," she snapped. "About broken homes, about discipline and responsibility, and what happens when structure disappears from our households." The phrasing was deliberate. Everyone knew what she was implying. And still Terrence didn't react. But someone else did. A woman near the front, mid-50s denim jacket, silver hoop earrings stood up. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hold a mic. She just spoke. "I don't have a question," she said, locking eyes with Karoline. "I have a thought." The room stilled again. "You don't get to define what manhood is for someone else," she said. "And you don't get to make jokes about someone's family and act surprised when they answer you with dignity." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. "That man didn't insult you," she continued. "He reminded us what real support looks like. You may not like the packaging, but that's strength. That's family." This time the applause didn't start cautiously. It started sure, scattered at first. then building. Karoline didn't respond. She swallowed, looked down at her notes, because it wasn't just about Terrence anymore. It was about her, about what she had said, about what she had tried to reduce, and how spectacularly that attempt had backfired. She didn't crumble, not yet. But the cracks were visible. Her voice returned with edges now, not sharp, just brittle. Well, she tried again. This is still a policy discussion. Not an episode of daytime TV. No laughter, not even smirks. Because the room had already decided this wasn't a show. It was a mirror. And they were done being entertained. That's what Karoline never understood. She came prepared to perform. But Jasmine and Terrence came prepared to be real. And when truth shows up even softly, even silently, performance looks cheap. Karoline shifted gears. Fast, fine, she said. Let's talk about fatherhood, about being present, about leading a family, because sitting silent while your wife gets attacked. Sorry, that's not the kind of man I grew up respecting. That got a few claps, half-hearted, mostly from the back. But right then, a voice whispered from the side row, soft but unmistakable. Sometimes silence is strength, baby. It was a grandmother from Dayton, seated beside her teenage granddaughter. Her words weren't meant for the room, but the room heard them anyway. The divide wasn't partisan anymore. It was personal. Karoline tried to salvage it. Look, she said softer now. I'm not against strong women. I respect Congresswoman Crockett. It takes guts to be up here, but if we're going to redefine masculinity tonight, can we at least admit that not everyone agrees on what it should look like? It was a smart move, measured, calmer, but it came too late, because the audience wasn't debating definitions anymore. They were reckoning with memory, with fathers who showed up and ones who didn't, with partners who stood behind them and ones who pushed them aside, with years of internalized scripts about what a man is supposed to sound like, only to watch those scripts crumble in front of them, because a man chose to speak without performing. The moderator tried to reset. Let's open the floor, he said, his voice tentative. Audience questions. Please keep them respectful. But what followed weren't questions. They were testimonies. And Karoline. She just listened, because she finally realized what everyone else already had. This wasn't about her anymore. It never really was. That truth sat on Karoline's shoulders, like a weight she hadn't prepared to carry, heavier than the camera lights, heavier than her own notes. Because when the room stopped centering her, she couldn't pivot. When the spotlight moved, her performance became background noise. And that's exactly what it had become, because the testimonies kept coming. They didn't sound like political questions, they weren't policy-specific. They didn't reference crime rates or economic forecasts. They sounded like kitchen table conversations, the kind people never have at a podium, but always remember in silence. I raised 3 boys alone, said a woman in the back row. And I didn't need a man to yell to prove he cared. I needed someone steady. I needed someone like that man. A young man, barely 20, voice cracking with nerves, stood and said, "My dad left when I was 5. I never really saw what it meant to stay, but I think I get it now, at least a little." The moderator glanced toward Karoline for a response, but she just shook her head slightly, lips tight. There was nothing to say, not without making it worse, because Terrence Crockett had done something she couldn't counter. He had taken all the power out of performance. And without performance, her entire identity crafted through years of camera-tested takedowns and talking points unraveled. But the thing about unraveling is this: it doesn't always happen with shouting. Sometimes it happens in silence, sometimes it happens in stillness. And this night had been built by both. Across the stage, Jasmine still hadn't raised her voice once. Her presence was anchored, strong, not in defiance and clarity. Because while Karoline tried to talk over people, Jasmine had learned the art of talking through them. And when she finally leaned forward again, eyes steady, the room leaned too. There are different kinds of strength, she said, not as a rebuttal, but as a declaration. Some get rewarded, some get mocked, but the kind that endures, that survives pressure, that doesn't need volume, just consistency. Her gaze flicked briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Terrence. You don't measure a man by how loud he is, she continued. You measure him by how steady he is when it counts. Simple words, but devastating, because there was no drama in her voice, only truth. Karoline straightened her back, forced a half-smile, and muttered, "That was heartfelt." But the room wasn't listening anymore. It was remembering all the times someone told them what manhood had to look like, what strength had to sound like, what family had to feel like, and realizing maybe for the first time that the blueprint was never real. It was just noise. and they'd been living around the echo of it for too long. Still, Karoline tried again. "I'm not here for emotional monologues," she snapped. "I'm here to talk about inflation, about crime, about schools collapsing. The average American doesn't care who's holding hands at dinner, they care about their grocery bill." It was a decent pivot, a strategic one, but it fell flat. Because Karoline still didn't get it. This wasn't about dinner tables or debates anymore. It was about visibility, about presence, about what it means to be in the room fully emotionally, spiritually, without needing to dominate it. And no policy bullet point could compete with that. Jasmine sat back. Her job was done. Terrence, still in his seat, didn't move, didn't smile, didn't gloat. He wasn't basking in the aftermath. He was just present. And that's what made it land even harder. Because it wasn't just that he stood. It was that he didn't try to keep standing. He knew when to speak. He knew when to stop. And the crowd, they weren't looking for applause anymore. They were listening for reminders. That's when another audience member, this one a middle-aged father with a ball cap and work-worn hands, stood up and said, "I've been in rooms like this, heard people talk about values, talk about what makes a man, but I've never seen it explained like that." He paused. That wasn't weakness, that was grace. Karoline didn't try to interrupt him, because she couldn't. She had been outmaneuvered by something no strategist had prepared her for: quiet integrity. Jasmine took the mic one last time, her voice soft, grounded. "We throw around phrases like family values like they're marketing slogans. But the real values, they show up in the moments no one plans, the ones no one sees coming. And they don't need to be defended, just lived." That line hit differently, because for the past hour, that's exactly what they had seen. No defense, just living proof. Outside night had fallen. The fluorescent lights of the community center flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the linoleum floor. The air was cool, still, but inside something had shifted permanently. People weren't leaving with bullet points. They were leaving with questions about what kind of partner they were, what kind of father, what kind of presence. And Karoline. She stood there still, flipping through her notes, looking for a line that might pull the gravity back to her. But it was gone. She hadn't lost a debate. She'd lost the room. Because for the first time, the audience hadn't been moved by force. They'd been moved by something stronger. A man who stood up when no one expected him to, and then sat down like nothing had changed. But everything had. Not just inside that small community center in Columbus, but far beyond it, in classrooms and kitchens, in quiet living rooms, where people were watching clips on cracked phone screens, or sharing the moment over text. Terrence Crockett hadn't planned to change the national conversation. He hadn't even planned to speak. But when he stood calmly, deliberately, and reminded the room what presence actually means, he touched something deeper than politics. And Karoline Leavitt. She never recovered her grip on that room, because the crowd wasn't looking for control anymore. They were looking for something real, something they'd just witnessed, something they hadn't expected to come from a quiet man in the fourth row. The rest of the town hall wrapped up on autopilot. Karoline finished her remarks with the forced rhythm of someone who knew the story had already moved on without her. Jasmine answered a few audience questions with the same grace and command that had come to define her. And Terrence, he stayed silent. Sat still, folded his hands. His job was already done. When the event ended, there were no reporters rushing for a soundbite, no dramatic exit. Terrence and Jasmine slipped out a side door. No entourage, no camera crews, just two people walking through a dimly lit hallway, their shadows trailing behind them. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned slightly into his side as they walked. "You good?" she asked finally. He nodded. "Yeah. You long day." He chuckled once, soft, dry. "You made it through." She looked at him. "No, you got us through." But he shook his head. "I just stood up, that's all." She didn't argue, she didn't need to. They both knew what had happened, not in headlines, but in the shift of breath, in the way the room recalibrated around a man who refused to play the game. They weren't walking away from a political skirmish. They were walking out of something much deeper, something quieter, a recalibration. That night back at home, Terrence reheated the leftover lasagna while Jasmine kicked off her heels and massaged the sore spot behind her shoulder. They didn't talk about Karoline. They didn't talk about the town hall. They talked about the garage light that still flickered, about whether cheesecake should be warm or cold, about the upcoming birthday party for their niece. But beneath it all was a hum a hum of something quiet but undeniable, the knowledge that the world had seen something rare, and that somehow, without asking for it, they had become the example people didn't know they needed. By the next morning, the clips had gone viral, and not because a PR team pushed them, not because a campaign account seeded them with hashtags. They spread because real people couldn't stop replaying what they saw. The caption under one of the most shared videos read, "He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he didn't posture, he just stood up." And everything changed. Another read, "Not all heroes wear suits, some wear silence." On TikTok, a video of Terrence's calm speech had over 3 million views before noon. A woman's voice in the background narrated the clip like a spoken word poem. This is what support looks like. This is what a backbone sounds like when it doesn't need to be loud. Veterans reposted it. Teachers replayed it in class. Relationship therapists referenced it in counseling sessions. A father in Georgia tweeted, "My son asked me why this guy didn't yell. I told him because real men don't need to." And in that tweet thread, something stunning unfolded, a mosaic of gratitude. Hundreds of comments, Black fathers, single mothers, queer partners, immigrant families, all recognizing a moment that didn't ask for applause but received it anyway. Because Terrence didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for everyone who's been told that quiet isn't power, that stillness isn't strength, that support has to be shouted to be real. But he showed the world what so many had always known: some of the strongest people carry the most, without making it about themselves. Karoline, for her part, tried to pivot the narrative. She gave an interview the following week, spinning her comment as a light-hearted moment taken out of context. But the damage was already done, not by outrage, but by clarity. People had seen too clearly. They'd seen the contrast between weaponized performance and rooted presence. And they weren't going back. Jasmine was invited on several major networks in the days that followed. She accepted only one. And when the host tried to center the segment around Karoline's jab, Jasmine paused, smiled gently, and said, "This was never about her. It was about us and what happens when mutual respect speaks louder than provocation." The host asked her if the moment changed anything in politics. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked off camera for a moment, then said, "I don't know if it changed politics. But I think it reminded people that love real love, the kind that holds steady even when it's being mocked, that's bigger than politics. And that's enough for me." In Columbus, something else was happening. At a Sunday service, a local pastor quoted Terrence's words. "You don't always need to raise your voice to raise someone else," he told the congregation. The church murmured back with quiet amens. A high school guidance counselor wrote Terrence a letter she never sent. "I didn't know how to show young men that strength could be soft," she wrote. "Now I just play them your speech." The city wasn't buzzing, it was reflecting. Because not all change roars. Some of it settles. Some of it sits inside people in the questions they ask themselves later, in the way they carry silence differently, in the kinds of men they choose to become, or raise, or love. Terrence never spoke about it again. He didn't do follow-up interviews, didn't tweet, didn't write an op-ed. He just kept living the way he always had, steady grounded behind the scenes, running his shop, fixing the roof, picking up groceries, checking on his mom, and Jasmine kept showing up in the halls of power head high, arguments sharp fire intact. But now, people saw her a little differently. Not just as the congresswoman who could hold her ground, but as the woman whose husband stood without stealing the moment. And that, maybe more than any applause, was the legacy of what happened that night. A man stood. He didn't make it about himself. And in doing so, he reminded the country what strength looks like when it's real. Not loud, not theatrical, just necessary, just enough.